Good evening dear students, welcome to Bajirao IAS Academy, the Hindu News Analysis. Today is 28th December 2024 and today we have some important articles for the discussion, and one by one we'll try to discuss all those important articles. And before discussing them, today we have one mains practice question, and this is also based on today's newspaper article, that is with respect to the depreciation of Indian rupee. Now depreciation of Indian rupee is regularly in news in recent times. So in this context, there may be a question in General Studies paper 3. So we'll try to discuss this particular question. We'll understand what are the reasons for the depreciation of Indian rupee and what the government can do to to control the depreciation of the Indian rupee. So we'll understand all these dimensions. The question is, depreciation of the Indian rupee has multiple implications for the Indian economy. So of course it has multiple implications for the Indian economy, and analyze the key factors contributing to the rupee's fall and its impact on the economy. So we are going to understand multiple dimensions of this particular question. Now in the introduction, so you could write some data with respect to depreciation trends on Indian rupee, and after that you could discuss about multiple implications of depreciation of rupee. So we knew that rupee has been depreciating, however you should also write what are the implications of depreciation of rupee for the Indian economy. So that is going to be the first part of the answer. And apart from that, you should also analyze key factors that have been contributing for the depreciation of rupee and also the impact on Indian economy as well. Now you can see this news article, that is, Indian rupee hits a fresh record low of 85.48 per dollar. Right, so this is the new low that Indian rupee has registered, and this indicates that Indian rupee has been depreciating. And on this image you can see some some factors or the impact of rupee depreciation as well as appreciation. Now how rupee appreciation impact Indian industry, how rupee depreciation impact Indian industry, all these factors are being given here. And in fact, rupee depreciation will benefit exporters. However, rupee appreciation will mean that imports turn cheaper. So rupee appreciation means imports will become cheaper for us. However, exports would become more and more expensive. Right? So vice versa happens with respect to rupee depreciation. So rupee depreciation means more exports. Right, so exports earn more money, and you can also look into the impact of rupee appreciation and depreciation on stock market as well. And foreign investors, particularly foreign institutional investors, stand to benefit from the rupee appreciation. If rupee appreciate, the foreign institutional investors will benefit from this, and subsequently increased foreign institutional investors inflows could fuel a bull run in the Indian stock market. So you can also understand the rupee appreciation and depreciation on fuels shocks as well. Right, so in the introduction, so how you can write introduction in this answer. The depreciation of Indian rupee has a far-reaching consequences for the India's economy. Right, so in fact both in terms of domestic inflation, for example, when rupee has been depreciating, so that impacts inflation at the domestic level, and it also impacts the external trade dynamics as well. And in fact, some recent global as well as domestic developments have intensified rupee's fall. Some developments at the global level and even at the international level have led to the fall or depreciation of rupee's value, and that further poses new challenges and opportunities for the various sectors in India. Now, what are the challenges with respect to the depreciation of rupee? So that is what we need to understand. Now, when rupee has been depreciating, so that means imports would be more costly for us. Imports would be more costly, right? So we may not be able to import essential commodities, or we need to spend more forex for our imports. But on the other hand, depreciating of rupee will help exports earn more money, right? So exports would earn more money because of depreciation of the currency, that we have already understood how it actually works, right? So in fact, depreciation of currency will also impact the domestic inflation as well. Now, how it impacts domestic inflation? So imagine that India has been importing almost 87% of its crude oil needs from other countries. Now, rupee value has been decreasing or depreciating. When India has been importing crude oil from other countries, India need to pay a higher amount for the import. So therefore, imports would become more expensive for India. So when imports become more expensive, don't you think that it would increase the input cost of companies, input cost of the industries? Certainly it would increase the input cost on the industries. So now these industries would transfer those excess costs onto the consumers. So that's how inflation would increase, whether it is fuel prices or durables or any other products. So consumers would have to pay a higher amount of money because of the higher input costs, because of the depreciation of rupee. So I hope you have understood this. Now we'll try to understand what are the key factors which have been contributing to the rupee's fall. There are some factors which have been contributing for the rupee's fall. One is global economic conditions. So it is also important that one thing that we need to understand, depreciation of rupee is not only because of the domestic factors. International factors also contribute for the depreciation of rupee. Firstly, we need to talk about the geopolitical tensions, Russia-Ukraine war, Israel-Hamas conflict, and Iran-Israel conflict, and Saudi Arabia-Iran conflict. So these geopolitical tensions should be understood, right? So because volatility, instability in Middle East will impact the oil prices as well. So higher oil prices means, so India need to pay a higher amount of money to import oil from other countries. So that would further increase inflation in India, right? So higher oil prices means that inflation not just in India but in other countries also, because oil reserves are mostly concentrated in the Middle East. And apart from that, we could also see aggressive monetary policies from major central banks of other countries, and those aggressive monetary policy stance of those respective countries also further strengthened US dollar, and that has been leading to the continuous depreciation of the Indian rupee. And secondly, rising crude oil prices is also another major reason. Now, how rising crude oil prices will lead to the depreciation of rupee and also increasing inflation, we have just understood that, because India heavily dependent on other countries for the imports of oil, and that is being coupled with the volatile global oil prices. So oil prices never been stable, right? So sometimes the oil prices are very high. So high oil prices means import of oil would become very, very expensive for India, and that very often creates a continuous demand for the dollar and further weakening the Indian rupee as well. And apart from that, in India, the current account deficit is also further widening, right? So current account deficit in the sense that the differences between the total exports and the imports in India. So that essentially means that we are importing more compared to our exports to other countries. But China is export driven economy. But India is not an export driven economy. However, India is still depending a lot on imports from other countries, and that has been leading to the widening of current account deficit. So persistent current account deficit due to increased imports and slow export growth has been leading to the pressure on the Indian rupee, right? So we have been importing a lot, but compared to the imports, we have been experiencing slow export growth, and that has been leading to the pressure on the rupee. Now, if you look at the data about the current account deficit in India, it is 2.2% of India's GDP in the financial year 2023. And in fact, current account deficit of 2.2% of GDP is very high because we have been heavily reliant on import of commodities like crude oil as well as gold because of a huge demand of gold in the domestic market. And apart from that, foreign portfolio investments are also another major reason for the depreciation of rupee. And in fact, foreign investments are two types: foreign direct investment, foreign institutional investment. And in fact, the foreign portfolio investment is also part of the foreign institutional investment. And in fact, foreign portfolio investment is very flexible. There is no stable or regular flow of foreign institutional investment, right? So in fact, global investors are also pulling out money from the Indian markets. So when they pull out money from the Indian markets, because why they pull money from the Indian markets? Because they are expecting better returns from other markets in different parts of the world, and because of that reason, they're pulling out money from the Indian markets. And it also further increased pressure on the Indian rupee. Now, when we have more foreign investment with us, that essentially means that we have more forex reserves. So more forex reserve means that compared to US dollar, Indian rupee would be more strengthened because we have more US dollar. But when the foreign institutional investors are withdrawing their investments, we do not have adequate dollars. But dollars are very important for our essential imports such as gold import or crude oil import. So when we don't have adequate amount of dollars, so that increases demand for the dollar. Increase in the demand for the dollar means depreciation of rupee. Now we'll understand what is the impact of rupee depreciation on the Indian economy. So this aspect also we need to understand now how rupee depreciation will impact Indian economy. Now firstly, it will lead to the inflation, or it will lead to a phenomena called imported inflation, because a depreciating rupee increases cost of imports, because we need to pay more rupees for import a certain commodity, either it is gold, either it is crude oil, right? So because of that particular reason, I have already explained that imagine that there is a company A, and this company A has been importing electronics. This company has been importing electronics from US or any other European country for that matter, even from China also, right? So because of depreciation of Indian rupee, this company A need to pay more number of rupees to purchase dollar, and they have to pay dollars to the importing country, right? So once they imported electronics, so it costed them a lot, and this substantially increases their input costs, right? So it substantially increases their input costs. While selling those products in Indian market, what they do, they pass on the excess amount of money to the Indian consumers, and that's how Indian consumers need to pay a higher amount of money for these electronics that they purchase. So therefore, this is called with the term imported inflation. This is also known as imported inflation. And apart from that, there is also a huge pressure on the trade deficit as well. Now, how it has a huge pressure on the trade deficit, because a depreciation may make Indian exports competitive, right? So when rupee has been depreciating, that essentially means that exports, it increases exports from the Indian economy. So it will also leads to, or it will also increases the import bill, particularly oil, diesel and other essential commodities. Okay, so to some extent it will benefit the Indian exports, but even though it benefiting the Indian exports, but we need to pay a higher amount of money to import other essentials, so thereby it would further leads to the widening of trade deficit. So as of now, trade deficit amounts to 2.2% of total India's GDP. And in fact, depreciation of rupee will also impact external debt that the country holds, because India's large external debt is in foreign currencies. So we need to repay our external debt in foreign currencies, and particularly in US dollars, right? So when we wanted to repay that amount, either interest amount or principal amount, we need to pay in foreign currencies, and again the demand for the foreign currencies increases, and it will again lead to the depreciation of rupee. And in fact, it will become costlier to service external debt as well, because we need to have more rupees to purchase US dollar, because its demand has increased substantially. And further, it will lead to the weakening of rupee. And secondly, worsening of fiscal deficit is also another major problem with rupee depreciation, right? So how it will further worsen the fiscal deficit? Because a higher cost of importing goods such as energy, raw materials, so they could increase government's subsidy burden, and it would also impact the fiscal deficit as well, because the government has also been providing subsidy for the importers in certain components, right? So increase in government subsidy in these component means that government needs to spend a more amount of money on these subsidies, and that in turn increase fiscal deficit, right? So this is how it will impact the Indian economy in multiple number of ways. However, there is a way to address rupee depreciation. So how can we address rupee depreciation? So we can address rupee depreciation by strengthening the forex markets, or forex reserves. Now, how can we strengthen forex reserves, attract foreign direct investment? We need to bolster foreign direct investment, because foreign direct investment is more sustainable form of investment. And we need to improve our ease of doing business in India, and that makes more and more foreign investors come and invest in India. And in fact, we should also focus on skill development as well, because we have a huge demographic dividend. So therefore, there is a need to work on skill development. There is also a need to work on ease of doing business, and we need to restructure our tax framework, and we should also restructure our labor laws. This is very important to attract FDI in large scale, particularly in the context of China plus one strategy of most of the European companies or West companies, which have been looking for the alternatives to China after the COVID-19 pandemic. Earlier, their manufacturing bases are located in China, but now they are looking for alternatives to China due to number of reasons, right? So this is one way through which India can substantially bolster its forex reserves. And secondly, India needs to focus more on exports, like how China is an export-led economy. In a similar way, India should also become an export-led economy. However, a global protectionism, however, headwinds against globalization are some of the challenges, but in this context, we need to focus more on giving a sustained push to exports, and that could also help India earn a huge forex reserves, and that could also help stabilize Indian rupee. and we should reduce import dependence. Except essential commodities, we should always focus on self-sufficiency, whether it is with respect to energy security, or whether with respect to electronics or any other essential commodities. So we should achieve self-sufficiency, and that is very important for economy, and that will also stop depreciation of Indian rupee. And apart from that, we should also control inflation. So for that, we could focus on maintaining balanced monetary policy as well as fiscal discipline. So in any way, if India wanted to achieve sustainable levels of economic growth, then we must focus on attracting more and more foreign direct investment. Foreign direct investment is very, very important for India to make sure that rupee depreciation is arrested, right? So next, we have some current affairs topics from the Hindu newspaper. So we'll try to discuss those aspects as well. The first article is about the union government reintroducing a detention policy, right? So earlier this detention policy was scrapped by the union government, but this detention policy again introduced by the union government. Now what is this detention policy? So detention policy essentially means that at the primary levels and even upper primary levels, so if any student fails to pass class 5 and class 8, they will not be promoted to the next class. They will have to again read or appear for the same class examination. So that is what is our detention policy that the center has introduced. Ministry of Education has introduced new norms for the student assessment, right? So what are those new norms for the student assessment? So the Ministry of Education has mandated final examinations. Now as of now, there are no final examinations up till 10th class, but Ministry of Education has mandated final examinations at the end of class 5 and class 8. And the Ministry of Education has also introduced detention policy as well. So if they failed to pass class 5 or class 8, so they will have to read or they will have to study a whole year the class 5 or class 8. And in fact, the union government has introduced detention policy for underperforming students, right? The central government has identified that most of the students are not acquiring the knowledge that is being required, and this detention policy will make sure that schools, students and parents would work on students' progress, and it improves learning outcomes of the students. So this marks a reversal from the earlier policies. So earlier policies including continuous and comprehensive evaluation of students, and even the earlier policy was also a no detention policy. So that sought to reduce pressure on the students. And in fact, why there was no detention policy earlier? Because it wanted to reduce pressure on the students at an early age, right? So because a detention policy at class 8 or class 5, it is like a much earlier age, and it will increase pressure on the students, and that's why the government was not introduced no detention policy. But now the government has come up with a detention policy for class 5 and class 8 to improve the learning outcomes. And going into the details, so what are the policy reforms that the union government has announced earlier, and how those policy reforms are being reversed by the union government now? Now initially we all knew that Right to Education Act, it is part of right to freedom under Article 21 of the Indian Constitution, particularly Article 21A of the Indian Constitution. And this comprehensive continued evaluation of students aim to reduce focus on high-stake exams by evaluating students' performance throughout the academic year. So this is the objective of continued and comprehensive evaluation method of students that was introduced as part of the Right to Education Act. And in fact, this policy has also aimed to ensure students were not detained until the completion of 8th class. Until the completion of 8th class, students were not detained. So thereby focusing on a supportive learning environment rather than punitive measures, right? So what is the punitive measure here? If a student not able to pass class 5 or class 8, a punitive measures will be implemented to make sure that he should reappear the same exam until he passes the exam, and that is the punitive measure. However, earlier there were no such punitive measure because at an early age of students there should be no pressure and there should be a healthy learning environment that has to be provided to the students, and there has to be a supportive learning environment. Right? So however, now the government has decided to go ahead with the detention policy. So that essentially means that if student in class 5 is not able to pass the final examination, so he will be made to reappear the exam again until he passes the exam. However, in the year 2019, the government has decided to remove the no detention policy and gave discretion to the states, and it is up to the states that whether they wanted to go ahead with the no detention policy or not. However, in the year 2019, the center has decided to remove this no detention policy. However, the recent changes that are being mandated by the Ministry of Education, so that has mandates final exams for class 5 as well as class 8 students, and in fact it also having provisions for no detention if students fail in those examination. So it also made some provisions for the detention of students if they fail in those examinations, right? So you can also go through with new education policy 2020 and in fact some of the features of new education policy. And apart from that, despite the reforms, many students are being graduated from primary school, right? So but even though they are graduated from their primary school, but they are lacking foundational literacy as well as numeracy skills. So foundational literacy and numeracy skills are very, very important for to indicate or to measure the better learning outcomes among the students. But students among the primary school level are lacking foundational literacy and numeracy skills, and this gap also further carried on towards the middle school as well, and this has raised a lot of concerns about the effectiveness of earlier reforms, right? So even though the government has undertaken a lot of reforms in earlier years, those reforms were not translated into results. So that is the main problem, and because of that particular reason, students at the primary level are lacking foundational literacy and numeracy skills, and this is further carried on to the middle levels of the schooling as well, and this would be further carried on to the higher levels of the education also. So therefore there is an urgent need to look into this and bring in appropriate reforms. And in fact, the government's decision to reintroduce this examinations for class 5 and class 8 and detention if they failed in class 5 and class 8 is a response to the need for improving learning outcomes, a supportive learning environment, a better learning environment, and also preparing skilled workforce. And in fact, if you look at India's skilled workforce, it is approximately 4.5% of total population, particularly in the workforce, are formally skilled. But on the other hand, if we wanted to compete countries like China, so which have made a tremendous progress in the area of manufacturing, it is very important that we need to skill our populations, and that could be started with the schooling itself. So therefore, if we wanted to skill our populations, if we wanted to improve our learning outcomes, it is very important that we need to focus on foundational literacy and numeracy skills at the primary and upper primary levels. And it is also very important to introduce detention policy as well, right? Because skill development is very important for us to reap the benefits of demographic dividend. And in fact, the issue of poor learning outcomes that we have been observing in primary and upper primary education is being viewed as a societal failure. It is not the failure of the school, it is not the failure of the students, teachers, or the parents, but it is a collective failure of the society, right? So therefore, since it is the collective failure of the society to ensure a holistic and inclusive learning outcomes for the children, so it requires collective efforts for improvement, which new policy aims to address, right? So this detention policy is expected to address the poor learning outcomes in primary and upper primary levels of schooling. However, there are some concerns and criticism also. So some experts have been criticizing the new policy of detention if students fail in class 5 or class 8. And in fact, private schools which are being affiliated with the CBSE, so they can easily implement this new policy. There's no doubt about that. However, it could be politically contentious for some states which are considered as poor states, or which do not have adequate resources, or the states where literacy levels are very low, states where the school infrastructure is very poor. So it could be a politically contentious issue. And apart from that, some critics also argue that bringing back single final examination is regression. So it is a regression, and in fact they also point out that it also undermines national education policy of 2020, and this national education policy of 2020 has been emphasizing on continuous as well as holistic education, right? Or continuous a holistic assessment of the students. However, there are concerns that private school might use this policy as a justification to expel the underperforming students, right? So private schools may expel the underperforming students, showing this detention policy of the government. So therefore, there is a high probability that the private schools might expel students from the disadvantaged backgrounds because they may not be able to pay the fee to the private schools. So therefore, adequate safeguards are necessary to prevent such practices. The government needs to introduce necessary steps, necessary measures to prevent such practices by the private schools. And it is also important to protect the interests of disadvantaged students, or students from the disadvantaged communities. So it is also about the literacy rates of India, literacy rates of women, schooling infrastructure. So we should also look into all those different aspects when we are introducing this detention policy again for class 5 and class 8 students. So next, there is another editorial that is given in the Hindu newspaper. So that is about marginalized by caste and marginalized in education. And it is specifically about lack of access to education to the certain communities which are considered as historically disadvantaged sections, right? So we'll try to understand what is the issue and what the author has been trying to say us. So one Dalit student's plight has gained significant attention on social media. right? So recently one incident has happened and that has gained a lot of attention in the social media. And in fact, that incident has involved a Dalit student. And it has happened with IIT Dhanbad, that particular Dalit student was not able to pay the tuition fees, and in fact the college almost decided to expel him from the institute because he was unable to pay the tuition fees. And this attention in the social media has led to Supreme Court to intervene and in fact grant him admission by exercising Supreme Court's extraordinary power under Article 142 of the Indian Constitution. So Article 142 talks about the power of Supreme Court to do complete justice. So Supreme Court can do complete justice under Article 142 of the Constitution, and in this case the Supreme Court has used its power to do complete justice. So this issue that has happened with this Dalit student in IIT Dhanbad has been highlighting systematic inequalities that are prevalent in our society. And in fact, because of these systematic inequalities, often the deserving students are deprived of the opportunities to prove themselves, and that is one of the very serious issue. And recently he had nearly lost his admission. The issue is actually he had nearly lost his admission to IIT Dhanbad after missing fee payment deadline due to financial constraints and also the technical issues, right? So this is the context. I hope you have understood the context. Now we'll try to understand what are the major challenges which are being faced by Dalit students in the Indian education system, right? So Dalit students literacy levels, among Dalits, literacy levels are very low. And in fact, Dalits are considered as historically disadvantaged groups, and there are certain affirmative action policies for the upliftment of the Dalit communities as well. However, we'll try to understand what are the major challenges which are presently faced by the Dalit students in Indian education system. So during the COVID-19 pandemic, Union government has launched Atmanirbhar Bharat Abhiyan. We all knew about that. So in fact, the objective or aim of Atmanirbhar Bharat Abhiyan to make India a self-reliant, particularly in different areas, but with respect to this particular aspect. So as part of Atmanirbhar Bharat Abhiyan, the government has also focused on ensuring self-reliance in higher educational institutions. So self-reliance in higher educational institutions has made that these IITs and IIMs substantially increase tuition fees, right? So they have substantially increased tuition fee after the call for self-reliance of educational institutions. However, all the students in these higher educational institutions may not afford to pay higher tuition fees. What about the scheduled caste communities? What about the scheduled tribe communities? They may not be able to pay higher tuition fee. In response to the criticism, the government has introduced a loan scheme, right? So education loan scheme that the government has recently introduced, that is Vidya Lakshmi scheme. And under this Vidya Lakshmi scheme, so students will be offered interest-free scholarships or interest-free loans for the marginalized communities or backward communities, right? Scheduled caste, scheduled tribes and other communities. However, the problem is that Vidya Lakshmi scheme actually falls short of addressing the broader financial challenges. Now, what are those broader financial challenges this Vidya Lakshmi scheme failed to address? So, in fact, a lot of Dalit students are not able to pay the tuition fees, because tuition fees in Indian Institute of Technologies institutes as well as the Indian Institute of Management, both IITs, IIMs, is very high, right? So they are not able to pay Despite these, Dalit students are performing better in their academics, right? So they are being excelled in their academics, but they are not able to pay the higher tuition fees because of their poor financial background, and that is the major issue. And here the National Crime Records Bureau data of 2021 has highlighted that over the last 7 years, around 122 students from IITs and IIMs have committed suicides because of various reasons, right? So one such reason is their inability to pay the tuition fees, and they have been facing a lot of discrimination, right? So in fact, they have been facing the financial stress and employment anxiety. So all these factors have led to around 122 students committing suicides in IITs and IIMs, and this is a very serious issue that has to be considered, and that required a greater attention. And in fact, many students from Dalit communities, they managed to enroll themselves in these prestigious institutions because they are committed and they do a lot of hard work, and they manage to enroll themselves in these prestigious institutions, and they eventually drop out due to their inability to afford rising education fee. So they manage to enroll, but after some time they drop out from these prestigious colleges because they are not able to pay higher education fees in these educational institutions. And in 2023, this issue was also raised in the Lok Sabha, right? So this is a very important issue, and this has to be raised. And in 2023, this issue was raised in Lok Sabha, revealing that over the past 5 years, more than 13,500 students from SC, ST, OBC had dropped out of courses in the central universities. Now you can see that 13,500 students in higher education, particularly from backward communities, dropping out of those courses from central universities is not, a simple issue. In fact, it is a very serious issue. And this has been indicating that there are some structural and systematic inequalities still prevalent in the higher education, and that required serious attention. And government should also consider all these aspects. And what should be the way forward in this context? The way forward is that there is a need to establish robust mechanisms to monitor compliance with the reservation policies for the Dalits, for the backward and the marginalized sections. And there is also a need to hold these institutions accountable for their non-compliance with the reservation policies. And also there is a need to enforce strict anti-discrimination policies and training programs within the educational institutions, ensuring that any caste-based harassment is addressed quickly and promptly. And apart from that, there is also a need to create peer mentoring programs that connect Dalit students with the mentors who can provide guidance and support. So these measures have to be undertaken. And apart from that, the financial condition of Dalits who are enrolling in the higher educational institutions like IITs and IIMs should also be taken into consideration, and the financial problems should not be a hurdle for their academic excellence, so that the government needs to consider. So next topic is, recently the household consumption expenditure survey has been released. Now in this context, we'll try to understand what exactly is this household consumption expenditure survey has revealed, right? So India's average household consumption expenditures or household spending on per capita basis has rose to 3.5% in real terms. Now when we talk about the real terms, it also takes into account the impact of inflation as well, right? So however, when we talk about the nominal terms, in nominal terms it will not take into account inflation, right? So it will not take into account impact of inflation, but real terms it will take into account the impact of inflation, right? The per capita spending rose about 3.5% in real terms through August 2023 to July 2024 from a year ago. And this data has been revealed by the Household Consumption Expenditure Survey, right? So apart from that, few other aspects that we need to understand here. And in fact, the Household Consumption Expenditure Survey, who conduct this survey? It is being conducted by National Sample Survey Office, NSSO, right? So it is being conducted by National Sample Survey Office, and this National Sample Survey Office is under Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation. So this is very important that you need to remember this, right? So apart from that, there are some other details which are being given here about the National Sample Survey Office, right? What are the functions, what are the responsibilities, what is the purpose of National Sample Survey Office. Now we'll come back to the Household Consumption Expenditure Survey. So the Household Consumption Expenditure Survey is designed to collect information on consumption and expenditure of the households on different goods and services, or a basket of goods and services. And in fact, the Household Consumption Expenditure Survey actually provides important and reliable data, and that data is being required to assess trends in economic well-being, to determine and also update basket of consumer goods, services, and their weights which are being used for the calculation of consumer price index. And why this Household Consumption Expenditure Survey and data collected by it is very important? Because this data can be used to measure poverty, inequality, as well as the social exclusion. And in fact, these are these social problems that we have been facing. And it is very important that we need to regularly measure the level of poverty and the level of inequality and also the social exclusion. However, the Household Consumption Expenditure Survey data provide important insights into these social problems that the government may come up with appropriate interventions to address these social problems, right? So this will also result in data-driven, evidence-based policy making to address these social problems. As I have already told you that this survey is conducted by National Sample Survey Office, which is under Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation. And there are some important and key findings of Household Consumption Expenditure Survey 23-24. Now, what is the nominal price? Now, nominal price don't take into account the impact of inflation. It will not take into account the impact of inflation. So in nominal prices, the average MPEC 2023-24, that is monthly per capita expenditure. The average monthly per capita expenditure in 23-24 increased about 9% in rural areas and 8% in urban areas from the level of 22-23. So this has been indicating that the monthly per capita expenditure of people living in both rural and urban areas has been increasing. So that means there is a higher level of inflation. If there is a higher level of inflation, generally what happened? People need to spend a higher amount of money to purchase the same basket of goods, right? So thereby it has been providing some information about increasing inflation in the economy and impact of increasing inflation on consumer choices as well. And in fact, if you look at urban rural gap in monthly per capita expenditure, it has declined to 71% in 22-23. Earlier it was 84%. right? So this is the urban rural gap in monthly per capita expenditure. So it was 84% in 2011 and 12, and it is declined to 71% after a decade of 2022 to 23, and it is expected that it will come down to 70% in the financial year 23-24. So therefore, this confirms that there is a sustained momentum of consumption growth in the rural areas. So there is a growth in the consumption even in the rural areas as well, right? So this is what the household consumption expenditure survey has been revealing us. That's all in this lecture, and thank you so much. And if you like our work, please subscribe our YouTube channel and also hit the like button. Thank you.